If I fix your bike, can you keep me? The question landed in the grease-scented air of Thunderfork Garage like a flat hand on a workbench, simple, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. A bell over the door didn't ring. The heavy flap of rubber and canvas closed with a soft thud. The men inside looked up from sockets and sockets of old coffee. Overhead lights buzzed. The tarp that had covered a rusted Harley for months shifted with the draft and suggested a sleeping thing, half forgotten. Brian stood in the doorway with a tool roll slung over his shoulder, scuffed sneakers, and hands that had learned to look older than his face. He looked 15, thin, with a jaw that still hadn't decided whether to toughen, but he moved like someone who'd done this work before, pulled, pried, tested a fit with muscle memory that belonged to another pair of hands. The tool set at his hip had belonged to his grandfather. It was his only inheritance and his only story. Rex, who wore the club's weight like a jacket and kept the garage's keys in the same pocket, squinted at the boy. His face had been carved from blunt words and long winters. He spoke in the currency of short sentences. Behind him, Butcher wiped his hands on a rag and leaned the socket wrench against his leg. Millie Restrepo sat at the back with a clipboard and a skepticism that had softened over years of knowing where miracles were required and where paperwork was non-negotiable. Diesel and Crow, their silhouettes half submerged in shadow, watched with the cautious curiosity reserved for an unexpected animal in familiar pasture. "You sure you know what you're asking?" Rex said. His voice was even, edged with a kind of protective suspicion. "We don't give homes away because a kid's got a temper and some tools." Brian's grip tightened around his grandfather's wrench. He thought of the last time he'd seen the man, James Carver, in the hospital, his fingers slack on the sheet, eyes cloudy but clinging to the rhythm of a life. He thought of the afternoons under a tin-roofed porch, the smell of oil, a voice that had taught him not just how to hold a wrench, but how to hold himself. He thought of the bike under the tarp and how it had been more than a machine, a promise that James had never finished, a piece of a life that had been left mid-task. "If I fix your bike," Brian said, and the words came soft but sure, "can you keep me? Just for a little while. 48 hours, I'll get it running." Rex's eyes flicked to Butcher and then to Millie. They exchanged a look that said everything about the kind of people they were, tough on the outside, careful with the kind of mercy that could be used or abused. Thunderfork was a place where the road met repair, where a man's reputation could be welded back onto a frame. It was also, quietly, a family of men who had learned to let in someone else only after he proved he could hold up his end. "All right," Rex said at last. 48 hours. You get it running, we give you a cot and food while the rest gets sorted. You fail, you sleep outside. No exceptions. Millie, you take notes." Brian felt the world compress to a single second of possibility and then expand again. He had a deal. 48 hours was a finite thing, impossibly short, but it beat the indefinite blight of nights in the park. He set the tool roll on the bench and unrolled the canvas, laying out wrenches with the ritual care of someone who treated tools like talismans. They pulled the tarp back. The Harley under it had an old man's wear, faded paint, chrome pitted by weather, a frame that sagged like tired shoulders. Dust lay in layers on the saddle. The engine was a dark shape, quiet as an animal wounded. Rex ran a hand along the tank as if testing a pulse. "This belonged to James Carver," Brian said, almost to himself more than to the men. "My grandfather. He started it once when I was small and couldn't finish. He was proud of it, said it was for the things he never got to do." Butcher's eyes softened for a moment. He'd seen enough bikes and more enough lives to know the difference between a machine and an apology. "So you've got 48, Butcher said. "No sleeping under the hood, no shortcuts. We watch, we help if you ask. But if you pull something 2 days in a row and think it's wiser than the man next to you, we'll tell you." Brian's answer was a nod, and the agreement laid itself between them, a fragile barter made of grease, time, and the kind of trust that must be earned. The first hours moved like slow gears. The garage was a cathedral for metal and improvisation. Light slanted through dusty windows and fell onto hands and faces. Brian set to work, and the place settled into the rhythm of labor. He took pieces off the bike with delicate violence, set them in patterns on old oil-stained paper, and treated every bolt as if it held a memory. He listened to Butcher more than he spoke, the older man's voice a steady guide that corrected without condescension. Over and over, the narrative of the 2 days formed itself. The boy's hands, the club's watchful silence, Millie's clipboard moving like a metronome. When the men weren't talking, there was sound enough. The clink of metal, the drag of a file, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the soft, contented grind of a radio tuned to something between talk and static. Coffee cups multiplied and emptied. Dust floated like a slow-time snowfall. Between the work and the waiting, Brian told stories, not long, but the kind of stories that anchor a person. How his grandfather had taught him to thread a bolt with one hand while holding a child with the other. How afternoons at the shop were stitches in a life that now felt unraveled. He spoke of the day James had left a cigarette in the ashtray, leaned back, and told Brian, "This bike will take you places I won't go." It had felt like a joke then. Now it hummed with the weight of unfinished promises. The narrative turned hard when Brian found the hidden compartment. He was cleaning out the frame when his fingers felt the give of a thin piece of metal nested where no one would naturally look. A false bottom in the frame that had been sealed with a careful hand. He pulled at it and found a small pocket with photographs tucked inside like contraband. The images were sun-faded and sharp at once. A young James in a uniform with a grin that didn't know all the things that would come. James beside a woman whose face was kind in the way that meant everything would be okay. A small boy with a shock of hair and an oversized sweater. Brian's father, long gone but present in the curve of a smile. An older James, younger than his disposition would allow, standing beside the bike in a field of grass. The same Harley in better days. The photographs reframed the bike. For Brian, they were a map of lineage, a proof that this was not merely a vehicle, but a hand passed down, a way of saying sorry, a way of keeping a promise when lips had failed. For the men in the club, they were evidence of a life that deserved closure. "You found his history," Butcher said quietly when he saw the pictures. "Not just parts." "They mean everything," Brian murmured, thumb tracing the edges. He kept them where he'd always find them, I think, like a promise he could touch. The discovery had a double edge. It softened the men and raised the stakes. The bike wasn't only about starting an engine, it was an act that would finish a story. Millie made a note on her clipboard and slid it in a folder that would become a slender legal lifeline. Dates, hospital records, the grandfather's name, proof that Brian had a living relative worth considering in the eyes of a state that measures safety in boxes and forms. "He's eligible for emergency kinship placement if we can show stability," Millie said later, hands folded over the file. She did not sound hopeful or harsh. She sounded precise. "We'll meet with a social worker. That's not custody. It's temporary shelter until a case plan gets filed. But it gives us something to stand on. Your grandparents' paperwork will matter, medical release forms, anything. We can't promise custody. We can only create the conditions the system looks for." Brian nodded. The life he had was a balancing act on the edge of a courthouse's clipboard. He had to turn grease into proof, nostalgia into evidence. He had 48 hours to make a machine that would make people believe he could keep himself. Montage of work. Time compressed into motion. The sun slid across the windows twice and then again. Brian's hands moved faster and surer. He learned to use men's help without shrinking. Butcher passing him a clip, Rex holding a lamp, Diesel pushing a part into place. It wasn't a contest, it was a choreography. They corrected his mistakes without scolding. They let him do the brave, visible acts and guided the subtle ones so no catastrophe unfolded. The garage filled with the economy of shared labor, each man a line in a larger sentence. At hour 36, when the night had folded over the city and coffee had been poured from the same pot more times than Brian could count, the bike coughed to life. They were outside for the test. The sky was a bruise at the horizon. Stars were indifferent. Brian had finished reassembling a set of parts, and when he turned the key, simple, ordinary, the engine answered with a sound that was small at first, and then found its volume, a living thing discovering breath. For a moment the world was all the sound of pistons finding rhythm and men exhaling. Cheers echoed low and honest. Rex put a rough hand on Brian's shoulder. Butcher's smile broke like a wrench across a hard line. For one heartbeat, everything brightened. The club tasted the triumph of a good day's work. And then it died. It sputtered. It lost cadence. What had been a promising purr fell away to a cough, a sound like a crooked clock. Brian's chest dropped, as if the victory had weight and had fallen. "Timing," Butcher said before anyone else, and there was no shame in it, only that raw, precise regret that comes when a small misalignment undoes hours of careful labor. He didn't explain. He named. That was both the mercy and the wound of the shop. Mistakes were catalogued honestly and corrected without blame. But some errors were heavy with consequence. Brian felt every minute of the 48 contract at once. He thought of the bed they might give him, and the paperwork that might sway if he could only run the engine again. He thought of the hospital, and the way James's hand had twitched when he tried to say something important and failed. Time, previously a friend, had sharpened into a blade. He sat down on a crate and let his forehead rest on his hands, the smell of oil and wet metal a comfort and a reminder of the fragility of the bargain. For the first time since he walked into Thunderfork, he felt the shape of being alone, but the club would not allow him to fail alone. They gathered around the bike like a circle of people who had been trained by hardship to know when to help. Millie closed her folder and came forward, not with legalese but with pragmatism. She pulled the document she had brought and reviewed it aloud, the paper acting as an anchor. The social worker's visit was scheduled for the next morning. The case could be made only with a show of stability. She looked at Brian and then at the men. "You got one more night," she said. "We can push for temporary shelter if it looks like he's got people ready to support him. But he needs to show he can follow through, and we need references. This place can provide that. It's on you, kid. Show us." Rex grunted. "And if we all pull, show us what you can really do. Don't hide from the hard part." What followed was not a sudden montage of miracle fixes. It was a night of communal resolve. They worked with the worn patience of people who had repaired other lives before. They spoke in short sentences that meant more than they said. Butcher leaned over the engine and guided without telling. Diesel passed parts and told stories that doubled as instruction. Crow kept the lamps low and the atmosphere steady. The men showed Brian how to stand when defeat was near and how to ask for help without shame. They spoke of small things that mattered, a way to thread a bolt so it wouldn't seize later, a reminder to keep fasteners clean, a counsel on the value of patience. But these were gestures of craft and character more than technical steps. Every suggestion was framed in an ethic rather than an instruction. Do the honest work. Don't cut corners. Treat the machine as you would a person who's been through trouble. At 2 a.m, while the city outside breathed differently, Brian whispered something he had not said aloud before. "He never had a funeral," he said. "Not really. People moved, things happened. He used to say the bike would be his way of getting back what he couldn't say." Butcher put a hand on his shoulder. "Then finish it for him," he said, "and do it right." They worked until the garage smelled like dawn. Fingers were raw, pride was bruised, but the machine leaned toward completion. Millie had not been idle. The legal world moved like a different ecosystem, precise and methodical. She phoned contacts. No promises, but inquiries. She handed Brian a short list of things he should know could help the case. Emergency contact info for men who would provide references, the hospital contact for James, records that showed Brian's presence during visits. She explained the difference between temporary placement and custody, in terms that did not hide reality but offered a path forward. "You earned this chance," she told Brian quietly as they filed paperwork into a folder. "But the court doesn't hand out families. We make a case that shows you have anchors. This place can be one of those anchors if the club is willing to stand with you." By the time the city was a pale smear, the engine turned over and stayed turned. It breathed, then found its voice. It was not a roar like triumph, but a sustained, honest note that built into something whole. The sound was a vow given and kept. When Brian killed the engine and stepped back, the men looked at him in a way that wasn't about judgment anymore. It was a different kind of appraisal, the slow assessment of a community deciding whether a person belongs. Rex wiped his hands, and for the first time in the story of the last days, did not keep them to himself. He reached across and ruffled Brian's hair like an older man might, a gesture that was both claim and blessing. "You did it," Rex said. "We'll stand behind you while the papers move. Not forever, not because we're saints, because you sweated for it." The social worker arrived mid-morning with a folder and a professional calm. She asked questions as one trained to spot the seams and hold up the threads. Where had Brian been living? Who could vouch for him? What contacts did he have? The men at Thunderfork answered with the kind of honesty that does not simplify but clarifies. Yes, they had pasts. Yes, some had lived outside the law briefly in younger days. But this place had structures and rules, and they would be accountable. They offered to host brief, supervised visits, to report regularly, and to keep a line open with the caseworker. Millie presented documentation, a witness list that read like a map of the garage, notes of Brian's steady presence, photographs of the bike being worked on, and of Brian's phone calls to James at the hospital. It was not a guarantee of custody, and nobody pretended it was. The social worker's role was to gather facts and make recommendations. A judge would consider them within the cold reality of statutes and precedent. But what the social worker could do was grant emergency kinship placement when a temporary guardian was reasonable and able to provide day-to-day care. It was a narrow door, and they placed their petitions carefully. Brian sat through the questions with a steadiness that surprised even him. He spoke of school, how his attendance had been patchy since James got sick, but how he returned worn notebooks with a note that showed he tried. He spoke of his grandfather's care, of hospital visits, of the tool set on his hip. When asked about his plans, he said plainly that he wanted to go back to school, to work at the garage, to finish the bike for the memory that needed finishing. "You've got people willing to vouch," the social worker said finally. "You've got a place to sleep and people who say there'll be a safety net. I'll file the emergency placement recommendation and we'll set a follow-up. It's not final placement, but it keeps you from being displaced immediately." Brian felt a small, urgent relief. It was not resolution, not the end of an arc, but a reprieve that mattered. Temporary shelter, supervised, with legal eyes watching. Not perfect, but humanely possible. In the months that followed, the story shifted into seasons. James was transferred to a Veterans Administration facility where he received care and visits. It was an efficient, polite transfer that offered dignity and routine. Millie handled the forms that allowed Brian to visit under the supervision required by the placement agreement. The visits were uneven. Some days James was lucid, telling small stories about his travels and how he always meant to ride across the states. Other times he was quiet, the left hand of his body slack where the stroke had taken command. They did not promise miraculous recoveries. Medicine kept to measured outcomes, and Millie insisted that hope be anchored to facts. But what the VA offered was a place for James to be cared for properly: rest, medication, and dignity. That mattered to Brian in a way that the words better care could not fully hold. Work at Thunderfork became Brian's timetable. He took a cot in the back, woke early to sweep the floor, and started to attend school again, tentatively at first, then more steadily. The men in the club treated him as an apprentice in the older sense of the word. He earned tasks not merely because they needed doing, but because his discipline and footprint in the days proved him. He learned to take responsibility for things that weren't glamorous: the inventory, the cleaning of oil pans, the organization of parts. But he also learned to listen, to accept correction without shrinking, and to offer help without being asked. When James's health declined, the community at the garage rallied. They adjusted shifts so Brian could visit, showing up in small, steady ways that paperwork doesn't capture. A warm coat for the hospital waiting room, a hand to steady Brian as he sat beside a bed, a voice on the phone when the nights grew long. Millie kept a file updated with hospital communications, maintaining the legal scaffolding, while the men and Brian provided the emotional architecture. James's end, when it came months later, was quiet. He passed with a nurse smoothing sheets and a soft pillow beneath his head. Brian was there. So were Butcher and Rex, their faces pale in a way that belonged to grief rather than shock. The funeral was modest. Family wishes dictated a small service, and the garage held a gathering afterward that felt like a ritual rather than a spectacle. The men circled around Brian and honored James's life with the kind of workmanship that blue-collar funerals often take. Hands that had once held a bike and now held a son of memories. At Thunderfork, they set a small display: James's patch, the faded leather of his jacket, and a brass plate they affixed to the wall in a place of honor. Millie recommended a wording that was truthful and quiet. The plate read, "Earned, not given. Welcome home." The words hung there like a verdict and like a benediction. The patch had been in the hidden compartment alongside those photographs, preserved as though the man had planned with humility that someone else might one day finish what he started. Brian placed the patch on the wall himself, his hands steady, though tears pricked the corner of his eyes. When he stepped back, the men around him, some with their faces carved by harder weather, were slow to applaud, but their nods were filled with a fierceness that was gentler than cheering. Time, which had at first been a threat, settled into something else. Brian's life found forms that could be counted on: a bed, visits to school, mentorship, and, in the slow accumulation of days, grades that crept up, and a job at the shop that was part craft, part payment, part repair of a life. He learned to be accountable for a schedule, to be on time for tests and for shifts, to answer to men who expected more than good work. They expected steadiness. The club remained imperfect. They argued sometimes about boundaries and about how far to go for one another. There were nights when the older men traded stories of their pasts, choices they had made and the cost, and Brian listened and learned, not from their justifications, but from the way they bore their consequences. That, more than any lecture, taught him responsibility. In the background, the legal machinery continued its slow work. Millie navigated hearings and filings with a steadiness that made the process less arbitrary. She called social workers, provided documentation of the men's consistent involvement, and chronicled Brian's school progress. It wasn't a guarantee that Thunderfork could become his legal guardian. It was a case that demonstrated stability, character references, and a plan for education and employment. When the judge reviewed the case, the documents and testimony painted a portrait of a young man who had found the kind of community that could offer daily structure and oversight. The judge, Judge Carrera, a woman known for her pragmatic compassion, listened to testimony from Millie, from the social worker, and from Rex. She asked about the men's backgrounds without judgment, focusing instead on the safeguards they proposed. She asked about supervision, schooling, and the plan for James's affairs. A legal outcome is rarely melodramatic, but the judge's decision was a significant hinge. She granted a temporary custodial arrangement with oversight. It meant the state recognized the emergency kinship placement as a responsible, short-term solution that would be reviewed. It meant Brian could legally remain in the care of adults who had offered to shoulder his day-to-day life while permanent plans were considered. Millie filed the necessary follow-ups. The garage became, for now, more than a workspace. It became a legal home base. The men at Thunderfork did not make promises they could not keep. They circumscribed their help with concrete steps, scheduled school check-ins, an expectation that Brian seek counseling to process grief, a roster of shifts and supervision. They insisted on accountability because they had been taught that kindness without structure can be harm. Brian accepted those terms, not as restrictions, but as the framework that let him build a life anew. Years moved forward in small, deliberate ways. There were birthday cakes that were simple and wildly outnumbered by the sound of laughter. There were nights when Brian, now less a boy and more a young man, sat on a stool and tightened a bolt he no longer feared to touch. The patch on the wall grew a world of small visits, a birthday card, an extra photograph, a lock of hair tucked into a locket that James had once kept. The brass plate remained in the entrance hallway, its letters catching light and throwing it back with a quiet insistence. Earned, not given. Welcome home. It became more than an artifact. It became a standard. New apprentices at the shop read it and felt its gravity. Outsiders who came in for work saw the plate and understood that this was a place where belonging required work and where work required belonging. Brian's growth was not linear. There were moments he slipped, bad grades, a fight that left his knuckles bruised by pride. But the men circled and corrected with the kind of practical mercy that expected better. He learned to apologize not because it made him feel better, but because it restored trust. He learned that being part of a community meant accepting help and offering it when the hour turned. When he was old enough to be what the world calls an adult, he stayed. Part of him left. He took short trips, apprenticed with other shops to broaden his skills, but he always returned. The garage was his anchor, and the rituals that had formed the early months of his stay, sweeping at dawn, checking in with Millie, visiting James's grave on the anniversary of his passing, remained. The patch with James's name stayed behind glass, and beneath it the brass plate now added a second line, small and private, where the men had engraved a date. The day Brian's name was added to the roster as a man in his own right. Thunderfork's membership grew hesitant around formalities of guardianship, but its moral membership was clear. Brian was one of them. He had earned it by showing up, by learning, by caring for others, and by keeping faith with the memory of a man who had taught him that a life could be mended if someone was willing to do the work. On the 15th anniversary of the day he first ducked under Thunderfork's tarp, they gathered. The garage smelled like motor oil and pie. Someone had brought a cake. The engine that once coughed to life now purred with a confident, even note, the sound of a machine well kept. Rex stood off to the side, older, his voice rougher but softer in the edges. Butcher clapped Brian on the back in a way that made the boy inside him grin. Millie stood with papers in hand, none of which were as important as the way she watched him, like a steward makes a final check. They hung a small plaque that day. New wording, 15 years and counting, under the brass plate that had started it all. The patch remained behind glass, preserved in reverence. Brian, now with a steadier face and muscle memory that belonged to a man who had worked his way across the small, essential steps of life, said nothing long. He didn't need to. His hand said what words could not, a handshake here, a loosened nut there, a steadying hand on Rex's shoulder. The story closed in a way that honored truth. No triumphant sweep, no tidy rescues from a world designed to complicate the lives of the vulnerable. It closed in the manner of slow victory, small certainties aggregated into a life. He had been given hours, and he had filled them with work and with the humility to accept correction and the courage to ask for help. If you listen closely to the sound that hangs there in the garage, the clink of a socket, the scrape of metal, the engine's gentle hum, you can hear the echo of the day's first question. If I fix your bike, can you keep me? It had been a plea, a wager, a line set down like a gauntlet. The answer had become the action. 48 hours of work, a night of near failure, a communal salvage that was both practical and spiritual. We tend to think belonging is given or withheld by chance, but Thunderfork's story argues otherwise. Belonging is earned, shaped by labor and mercy, and kept by habit and accountability. It is a covenant not of law, but of mutual care. Craftsmanship as moral language. It says the world can be mended if people decide to stand with one another and to do the small, honest work that trust requires. What would you risk to prove you belong? Would you wake at dawn, sweep the same floor until it's spotless, show up when you're tired, accept correction, and offer your hands when a neighbor needs them? Drop a comment and tell the story you would trade for a chance to be held. If this kind of real-life redemption matters to you, consider subscribing for more stories about family, second chances, and the communities that keep us.